The cold came early that year to Carson City, Nevada. Not the polite autumn chill that eases people into sweater weather and pumpkin pie, but the hard, aggressive cold of a high desert winter that arrives 6 weeks ahead of schedule and acts like it owns the place. By the first week of November, the pipes under Desert Pines Trailer Park had already frozen twice, and the maintenance man that Harlan Beck employed, which was a generous use of the word employed, had patched the ruptures with duct tape and optimism, both of which are poor insulators against a Nevada winter. Marguerite Crowe had lived in Unit 14 for 4 years. She would not have chosen it under different circumstances, but circumstances she had long since learned were not in the habit of asking permission before they rearranged your life. She was 72 years old, 5 feet 3 inches tall, and built the way women are built when they have spent 50 years doing work that most people associate with men. Her hands were the first thing anyone noticed, large for her frame, knuckle-scarred, permanently stained with engine grease in the creases, despite the fact that she had not worked a professional job in 3 years. The kind of hands that tell a story before the mouth opens. She had been a mechanic, not a hobbyist, not a weekend tinkerer who changed her own oil and considered herself technically inclined. A working mechanic, licensed, certified, the owner and sole operator of Crowe's Auto and Cycle Repair in Tonopah, Nevada for 23 years. She had rebuilt carburetors and replaced timing chains and diagnosed electrical faults that had stumped 3 other shops before the customer finally found her. She had done this in a building with her name on the front in a town where the first 2 people who hired her were convinced she would fail within 6 months, and she had outlasted both of their businesses. She had also raised a son. Silas Crowe, born 1973, killed in a car accident on Highway 95 outside Fallon in 2018. She had buried him on a Tuesday in October in a cemetery outside Tonopah where the wind never stopped and the headstones leaned from it like old men leaning into weather. She had stood at the grave in her good black coat with her granddaughter's hand in hers, and she had not cried because she had learned a long time ago that grief like an engine runs better when you do not flood it. The garage was gone by then, had been gone for years. Dex Howard had seen to that, but that is a story that has a beginning and a middle and an end that has not arrived yet, and it will be told in its proper order. What mattered on the night of November 8th was this. Marguerite Crowe was sitting at her kitchen table at 9 in the evening, a cup of coffee going cold beside her left hand, and a shoebox open on the table in front of her. The shoebox had come down from the shelf in the back of the trailer's only closet, where it had lived for 3 years since the day she carried it out of the storage unit in Fallon that had held Silas's things after the accident. She had told herself she would go through it when she was ready. She had not been ready until tonight. Ivy was asleep. The girl was 9 years old, and she slept the way children sleep when they are exhausted down to the bone, flat out. Arms spread, mouth open, her dark hair a mess across the pillow. She was in the back room of the trailer, the smaller one that Marge had given her because it had the window that faced east, and in the morning the sun came in first thing and lit the room up gold before the rest of the day could get it at it. The oxygen concentrator that Marge ran for her heart condition hummed in the front room. It was the white noise of their nights, the constant mechanical breath that said the equipment was working, the body was managing, one more night was being gotten through. Marge was careful about the heart condition, careful in the specific way of someone who cannot afford to treat it properly and has therefore decided to treat it around the edges. She took the one medication she could afford from the discount pharmacy in Sparks. She walked slowly, rested when she needed to, avoided the kind of exertion that made her chest go tight in the way that reminded her that the organ keeping her alive was operating on a budget. She had not told Ivy how serious it was. Ivy was 9 years old and had already buried her father and watched her mother disappear into a fog of grief and medication that had not lifted before Elena's lungs gave out the following spring. The child did not need another thing to be afraid of. What Marge had not told Ivy, what she had not told anyone, was that the medication she could afford was not the one the cardiologist in Reno had prescribed. It was the cheaper version, one that was close but not identical, the one that the doctor would have shaken his head at if he had known, which he did not, because Marge had not gone back for a follow-up appointment since March. The copay was $47, and she did not have $47 on the 3rd of the month, which was when the appointment had been scheduled. She poured the shoebox contents onto the table. Photographs mostly. Silas at various ages. Silas at 8 on a bicycle in their front yard in Tonopah, with a gap-toothed smile and grass stains on both knees. Silas at 19 in the parking lot of a convenience store with 3 friends whose names she no longer remembered, all of them squinting into the sun with the aggressive confidence of young men who believe the world is a problem they can solve. Silas at 30 leaner, the confidence replaced by something quieter, standing in front of a motorcycle she did not recognize with a woman named Elena beside him, her dark hair blowing sideways and her eyes bright with whatever it was that made Silas choose her, which was something Marge had understood from the first time she met the girl. There were receipts and ticket stubs and a folded piece of notebook paper that turned out to be a grocery list in Silas's handwriting. Milk, bread, coffee, motor oil. Even his grocery lists were practical. At the bottom of the box, under a rubber band that had dried and cracked with age, she found 2 things she had not expected. The first was a photograph she had never seen. Silas, mid-20s, laughing the kind of laugh that reaches the eyes and lifts the whole face, sitting on a Harley-Davidson with a tattoo of a raven visible on his right forearm. Behind him, a cinder block wall displayed a patch she recognized from somewhere she could not immediately place. Iron revenants, the letters worn on the bottom rocker, the image at the center, a broken chain above a road stretching to the horizon. The second was a letter, sealed envelope, her name on the front in Silas's handwriting. The slanted, hurried script she had been reading since he was 7 years old and first learning to form letters. She stared at it for a long time before she picked it up. She understood immediately that he had written it knowing she might need it. A man does not seal a letter with his mother's name on it and place it at the bottom of a shoebox unless he has thought carefully about the circumstances that will bring her to it. Silas had always been a planner. He had planned the garage's expansion before she needed it and planned Elena's wedding before he proposed and planned the route of every ride he took on that motorcycle with the same precision that other men reserved for financial portfolios. He had also apparently planned for the possibility that things would go wrong in ways he was not around to fix. She opened it. The letter was 3 pages handwritten on lined paper torn from a spiral notebook. She read it once, then read it again more slowly, then sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling of the trailer for a long time. The oxygen concentrator hummed. Outside, the wind off the desert pushed against the aluminum walls with a sound like breathing. She read the letter a 3rd time. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and put it back in the envelope and held the envelope in both hands on the table in front of her. He had told her about the men, about Graves Mercer and the Iron Revenants, who he had ridden with for 4 years before he met Elena, who had been his family in the way that clubs become families for men who need a different kind of belonging than blood can provide. He told her they were good men in the complicated way that men who have done difficult things can still be good. He told her that Graves had a debt to her specifically, one that predated Silas's time with the club, though he did not explain what the debt was. He had said this: Graves will know. When you show him the photograph and tell him who you are, he will know what he owes. He had told her what he had discovered about the club's past: the Vipers, the money, the corridor, the accident on Route 446. He had told her about the second ledger and what it proved and why he had left and why he had not been able to go back without forcing a confrontation that would have destroyed the Brotherhood entirely. He had written, "I chose Elena and I chose peace, and I chose to let men I loved continue to live without the weight of what I knew. I am not certain that was the right choice, but it was the choice I made." And then the last paragraph, which she read 3 times and which she had already memorized by the time she finished the 3rd reading: "If life turns dark, mama, and it might because things turn dark, that is their nature, find Graves Mercer. The Iron Revenants are based outside Reno. They drink at a place called the Silver Dust Diner on Route 50. Tell him who you are and show him the photograph. He will come. I know this the way I know how an engine runs. Not because I can see inside it, but because I have listened to it long enough to know its sound." Marge sat at the table until 10:30. Then she stood, washed her coffee cup, and went to the window to look at the trailer park. The orange streetlights turned everything the color of old photographs. Beck's truck was parked outside Unit 3, where it usually was at this hour. It had been there more nights than not for the past month since she had fallen 3 months behind on rent, and he had started appearing at her door with increasing frequency, his voice carrying the particular register of a man who knows he has leverage and is deciding how to use it. She went back to the table. She picked up the photograph of Silas with the iron revenants patch behind him. She turned it over. On the back in Silas's handwriting, a phone number with a 775 area code and two words silver dust. She did not call. Some conversations needed to be had in person, and she was old enough and practical enough to know which ones. She went to bed and set her alarm for 6 in the morning, which was when she needed to get up to drive Ivy to school before the bus stop closed registration for late riders, and she lay in the dark with the oxygen concentrator humming, and Silas's letter on the nightstand beside her, and she thought with the methodical calm of a woman who has solved difficult problems her entire life about what she was going to do next. The morning was ordinary in the way mornings are ordinary when they are about to stop being ordinary. Ivy ate cereal and asked if she could have a different backpack because the zipper on hers was broken, and Marge said she would look into it, which was the answer she gave when she could not say yes but could not explain no. She drove Ivy to school in the 2009 Chevy pickup that she maintained herself because maintenance was the one expense she could reduce by her own labor, and she watched the girl walk through the school doors with a particular brisk purposefulness that Ivy had developed sometime in the past year, the walk of a child who has decided that forward momentum is a form of protection. Then she drove to the Silver Dust Diner. She had driven past it before on the way to the pharmacy in Sparks, and she had always registered it the way you register landmarks you have no intention of stopping at. A squat building at the edge of the highway, its sign weathered to near illegibility, its parking lot large enough to accommodate a row of motorcycles and the trucks of the kind of men who eat steak at 11 in the morning and consider it a reasonable meal. She had never had reason to stop. She stopped now. It was a Tuesday which she had chosen deliberately. A Tuesday mid-morning was less likely to be a full house situation. She did not know these men. She did not know how this conversation was going to go, and she had enough experience with the world to understand that the conditions under which you have a difficult conversation matter as much as the words you choose. She sat in the truck in the parking lot for 4 minutes. She looked at herself in the rear-view mirror. 72 years old, gray hair, cut short, mechanic's hands on the steering wheel, wearing a flannel shirt that was clean, and a coat that was warm enough, and boots that had lasted 8 years and would last 8 more if she took care of them. She looked like what she was. A working-class woman from the high desert who had seen things go wrong and had learned to hold her ground anyway. She got out of the truck. The diner was half full. A counter with 6 stools, 4 of them occupied by men in various configurations of work clothing and road weariness. Booths along the wall, most of them empty at this hour. A waitress in her 40s who had the efficient, distracted air of someone whose entire professional existence had been organized around the question of who needed what and how quickly she could provide it. And in the back booth, 3 men in leather cuts with the iron revenants patch on the back. Marge registered them the way she registered any new variable in a mechanical system, with attention without alarm, filing their details against what she knew. One was enormous, the kind of large that suggests not gym membership, but decades of physical work and genetic circumstance, bald with a left eye that drooped slightly and a face that had learned to be still long ago. One was lean and quiet, a paperback book open in front of him, but his eyes tracking the room over its pages with the focused awareness of a man who has trained himself never to stop reading his surroundings. And the third was the man in the center, back against the wall, silver in his beard, burn scars visible above his collar and crawling up the left side of his neck, hands wrapped around a coffee mug. The eyes that looked up from the mug when she walked in were gray, storm gray, the color of Nevada sky 2 hours before it decides what kind of weather it is going to make. She walked to the back booth. She did not hurry. She did not hesitate. She had driven 40 minutes in a truck with a heater that worked on one side, and she had something to say and she intended to say it. She stopped 2 feet from the table and looked at the man in the center and said, "I am Marguerite Crow. Silas was my son." The booth went still. Not the whole diner. Just the 3 men in the back booth, a stillness that was not surprise so much as rearrangement, the way a machine stills when a new gear engages everything, pausing to accommodate the new configuration. She reached into her coat pocket and placed the photograph on the table. Silas at 20-something, laughing, the raven tattoo on his forearm, the iron revenants patch on the wall behind him. The man in the center looked at the photograph. He looked at it for a long time, the way a man looks at something that changes the shape of what he thought was true. Then he looked at her hands, her mechanic's hands, large and scarred and permanently stained, and she watched something move behind his eyes. Not recognition of her face. She had been 20 years younger the last time he saw her, and it had been dark, and it was not the kind of encounter that lodges in memory as a visual, but recognition of something else, the specific bone-level recognition of a debt returning. He said Tonopah, 1989, the Ford pickup with the blown head gasket on Route 376. Marge said, you had $60 in your wallet, and you tried to give me all of it, and I told you to keep 40 because a man traveling alone in the desert at night should have emergency cash. The big man had stopped chewing his eggs entirely. The lean man's book had closed. Graves Mercer said, you kept my motorcycle in the garage for 3 days while I waited for parts. Marge said, you slept in the waiting room because you said a bed would feel dishonest when the road was not done with you yet. He said, I never forgot that garage. I passed through Tonopah twice after that looking to stop in, and I never caught you open. She said I closed in 2004. Someone made it impossible to stay. She said this flatly without self-pity, in the tone of a woman reporting a fact about a system that had failed her rather than a wound she was still carrying. Though she was still carrying it, she simply carried it without display. Graves put both hands flat on the table and stood up slowly. He was a large man, larger than she had remembered, though memory does strange things to scale. He stood and he looked at her for a long moment, and then he said the only thing there was to say. Sit down, he said. Tell me what you need. She sat. She told him. She told him about Beck and the 3 months of back rent and the eviction notice that had arrived on a Monday with the language of inevitability, the language of a system that has already written the outcome and is simply going through the procedural motions of pretending otherwise. She told him about Ivy. She told him about the county caseworker who had been watching their situation since a neighbor made a report last spring about the watch list and what it meant and what it could mean if conditions deteriorated. She told him about her heart. She had not intended to tell him about her heart. The words came out with the momentum of everything else she was saying, and she let them because she was tired. She realized of managing the information about her own deterioration with such precision. She was tired of deciding what to tell Ivy and what to hide and what to tell the pharmacist and what to omit from the forms at the free clinic because she had learned that the forms, if you filled them out honestly, triggered consequences you could not afford. The lean man whose name was Vale was listening in the particular way of a man who had medical training, his attention becoming surgical when she mentioned chest tightness and shortness of breath on exertion, and the fact that she had been substituting the affordable medication for the prescribed one. His face did not change expression, but his hands did. They went very still on the table in front of him, the stillness of someone who has just done a calculation and does not like the result. She told them about the shoebox. She took the letter from her coat pocket, Silas's letter, and placed it on the table beside the photograph. She did not give them permission to read it. She simply left it there and said, he told me to find you. He said you would know what you owe. And then she looked at Graves directly and said, I am not here for charity. I am here because my grandson's daughter needs stability, and I cannot provide it alone. And I am old enough and practical enough to ask for help when asking is the only option that remains. Graves picked up the letter. He read it. His face changed. Not dramatically, not with the theater of visible emotion, but with the subtle seismic shift of a man receiving information that rearranges the foundations of something he had understood differently for a long time. He read the entire letter without speaking. Then he refolded it and placed it on the table, and he was quiet for a long time. Vale said quietly, Marge, what medication are you taking instead of the prescribed one? She told him the name. Vale looked at Graves with an expression that communicated something in the silent language of men who have spent years reading each other's faces under circumstances that did not permit spoken communication. It was not a good expression. The big man Boone, who had been silent through all of this, eating his eggs with methodical focus while his eyes moved between Marge and Graves and the letter. And the photograph said, the girl, where is she now? School, Marge said. I drive her there every morning. She gets out at 3:15. It was 10:47 in the morning. Boone nodded once slowly, the nod of a man accounting for variables. Graves said, are you driving back to Carson City today? Marge said, that is my plan. Yes. Graves said, we would like to come with you. She looked at him for a moment. She was not naive. She understood that 3 men on motorcycles following an elderly woman in a pickup truck to a trailer park in Carson City would create a particular kind of attention, the kind that included neighbors looking through curtain edges and Harlan Beck making phone calls. She also understood that the alternative was going back to the trailer alone and waiting to see which arrived first, the eviction notice or the caseworker, or the next time her chest went tight in the way that meant she needed to sit down and breathe slowly and hope it passed. She said, "I will be picking up my granddaughter at 3:15. Graves said, "We will be there." She left the diner before they did. She drove back to Carson City at the speed limit because the truck did not like to be pushed past 60, and she was not in the habit of asking things to do what they were not built for. In the mirror, when she reached Route 50, she saw three motorcycles fall in behind her at a distance that was deliberate, not following, accompanying. There is a distinction, and it is felt rather than seen. She drove home and changed the beds because if people were coming to her home, she was going to have clean beds, and she washed the dishes that were in the sink and wiped down the counter and looked at the trailer with the eyes of someone seeing it for the first time. The broken heating unit held together with wire. The plywood over the window where a crack had appeared, and she had not had the money to replace the glass. The stack of bills on the counter with the red final warning stamps. The prescription bottles, some full, some partial. None of them the correct medication at the correct dose. She looked at all of it, and she did not feel shame. Shame is what you feel when a situation reflects a failure of character. What Marge felt looking at her kitchen was rage, a clean structural rage at a system that had created this situation through the accumulation of policies and cause and the particular American genius for making survival expensive. She had worked her entire life. She had paid her taxes and raised her son and run her business honestly for 23 years. And what she had to show for it was a trailer in Desert Pines with a broken heating unit and a heart medication substitution, and a granddaughter who ate free lunch at school and thought it was normal. She was still standing at the counter with this rage when she heard the motorcycles pull into the lot. There were more than three. She went to the window. 6 motorcycles, then 7, then 2 more pulling in behind. 9 men in leather cuts with the iron revenants patch parking in a row along the mud track outside Unit 14 with the synchronized efficiency of people who have done this kind of thing before. Graves dismounted first. He looked at Unit 14 with the steady assessing gaze of a man reading a situation rather than reacting to it. Then he walked to her door and knocked. She opened it. He said, "I called some of the brothers. I hope that is all right." She looked past him at the row of bikes and the men standing beside them with their hands in their pockets and their breath clouding in the cold. Large men, scarred men whose collective biography was written in the architecture of old injuries and the particular stillness that comes from having survived things. She recognized the type. She had dealt with men like these her entire working life. Men who arrived at her garage with motorcycles that needed fixing and a guardedness that needed more time than the mechanical work did. She had always given them both. "It is all right," she said. "Come in." They did not all fit in the trailer. Graves and Vale and Boone came inside. The others positioned themselves outside in the cold with a naturalness that suggested they had done exactly this before. Stood between a building and the rest of the world without being asked because it was simply the obvious place to be. Vale crouched beside the oxygen concentrator and examined it with the focused attention that Marge now understood was not curiosity, but professional assessment. He checked the connections, the flow rate, the filter housing. He did not tell her anything was wrong. He also did not tell her everything was right, and she noticed the omission. Boone opened the refrigerator. He stood in front of the open refrigerator for 3 seconds, and then he closed it. He did not look at Marge when he turned around. He looked at the counter, at the bills under the coffee mug, at the prescription bottles. Then he looked at the floor. His neck had gone red above his collar. She said, "I know what it looks like." He said, "I am not judging." She said, "I know that too. You are angry, which is different. So am I." He looked at her then, direct for the first time since they had met that morning. Something passed across his face that was too complicated to name with a single word. Recognition, maybe. The specific recognition that sometimes exists between people who have held the same kind of weight in different ways. Graves was reading Silas's letter again. He had brought it in from the table where she had left it earlier, holding it with both hands, reading slowly. She watched him and waited. He finished. He set it down. He said, "Crow told you about the vipers." She said, "He told me everything." He said, "Then you know what I am." She said, "I know what you were. That is not the same thing, and I am 72 years old, and I have been making this distinction about men my entire life. Now, are you going to help us, or are you not?" Graves looked at her for a long time with those storm-gray eyes. Outside, the wind pushed across desert pines with the indifferent persistence of Nevada weather. The heating unit in the corner ticked and struggled. The oxygen concentrator hummed its steady mechanical breath. He said, "Yes," she said, "then we should talk about the landlord." As if on cue, a door slammed outside. Heavy footsteps on gravel. Harlan Beck's voice came through the thin aluminum wall before the man himself appeared at the window, flashlight sweeping the row of motorcycles with the adrenaline-addled confusion of a man who has arrived at his usual Tuesday evening confrontation and found the board has been cleared and reset with unfamiliar pieces. Marge went to the door before he could knock. She opened it and stood in the frame. She had Beck by 3 inches, which was not a physical advantage, but posture is not about inches. She had the posture of a woman who has stood her ground in difficult situations since before Harlan Beck was old enough to sign a lease, and that posture took up more space than height alone accounts for. Beck's flashlight was leveled at the motorcycles. His mouth was open to say something he had clearly rehearsed on the walk over from Unit 3. He was not going to get to say it. Graves stepped into the doorway beside Marge. He did not block her. He stood beside her, which was a different thing. The difference between replacing someone and standing with them. Beck's flashlight beam moved from the motorcycles to Graves's face and stopped. The sentence Beck had been planning did not arrive. "How much?" Graves said. Beck said, "What?" "The 3 months," Graves said. "How much?" Beck told him. Graves reached it into his cut and counted bills without looking down. He held the money out. Beck took it and counted it and looked up with the expression of a man who has just had a lever pulled from his hands and does not yet know what to do with his own grip. Marge said, "In the window." Graves said, "The window gets fixed this week." Beck looked at the row of motorcycles behind him, at the men standing beside them, who had not moved, who had not spoken, who were simply present in the cold Nevada night. He looked at Boone, who was standing in the doorway behind Graves and Marge with his arms folded and his face arranged in the particular expression of a man who has done 4 years in a state facility and has therefore permanently exhausted his capacity for pretending that civilian intimidation is interesting. Beck said, "This week." He left. Marge watched him go. Then she went back inside and sat down at her kitchen table. Vale sat across from her. He placed a pulse oximeter on her finger without asking permission, the way a mechanic connects a diagnostic reader without explaining what it does, because the explanation would take longer than the reading. He looked at the number. He said, "When is the last time you saw the cardiologist?" She told him. He said, "You are going to need to see someone this week." She said, "I cannot afford." He said, "I know. We will work that out." She looked at him. She had spent her life reading people, not as a social skill, but as a professional one, the way a mechanic reads an engine by listening to its particular quality of distress. Vale was not soft. He was not performing kindness. He was doing what she had always done, looking at a system that needed attention and applying the skills available to the problem in front of him. She could respect that. Outside, she heard the brothers talking, low voices, the rearrangement of logistics, the sound of men who were not leaving. Graves appeared in the doorway. He said, "We would like someone to stay tonight, if you will allow it." She said, "Where will they sleep?" He said, "They have slept in worse places than parking lots." She said, "There are extra blankets in the closet." And she said it the way she said things that were settled without ceremony, because the decision had been made and further discussion was not the use of the time. At 3:15, she drove to school. Graves rode beside her truck, not behind it, alongside it, the way you ride beside something you intend to keep safe. She was aware of this. She did not comment on it. Ivy came out of the school doors and stopped at the top of the steps when she saw the motorcycle. She looked at it, and then at her grandmother, and then at the man on the motorcycle, studying each variable with the careful attention of a child who has learned that new elements in a familiar situation require assessment before acceptance. Marge opened the truck door and said, "Get in, baby. We have company." Ivy got in. She settled her backpack on her lap and looked at Graves through the windshield and said, "Is that the Raven?" Marge said, "What?" Ivy said Dad had a picture, a man with a raven tattoo on his arm. He told me it was his brother. Marge looked at Graves on his motorcycle. He had heard. His expression was careful, controlled, but something had shifted behind his eyes in the way that something shifts when an unexpected weight is placed in the center of something you are already carrying. Ivy said, "He told me if things went really wrong, I should find the man with the raven. He told me he would always come." Marge said, "He came." Ivy looked at the motorcycle and then at her grandmother and then at the motorcycles that had fallen in behind them as they pulled out of the school parking lot. She was quiet for a moment, the quality of quiet that precedes understanding. Then she said, "Are things going really wrong?" Marge said, "They were. They're getting better." That night was quiet in the way that nights are quiet when a long siege has lifted enough to let you breathe, but not enough to put down your guard. 3 Iron Revenants stayed. Vale slept in the front room with the oxygen concentrator and his medical training and his ability to hear the difference between the sounds a person makes when their body is managing and the sounds a person makes when it is not. Boone stayed on his bike. Graves sat outside on the cinder block steps with a cup of coffee Marge had made him, and she sat inside at the kitchen table, and they spoke through the screen door in low voices, while the desert cold pressed against everything, and the stars above Carson City were the particular kind of brilliant that only exists in the absence of clouds and the presence of nothing. No city glow, no humidity, just 150 miles of empty basin in the unobstructed dark. He told her about Silas. Not the facts, she knew the facts. He told her about the quality of the man, the way Silas had made every other person at the table better at the thing they were trying to do, not by telling them, but by being present in a way that made the standard feel natural. He told her about the morning in Tonopah when the engine on his road bike had seized on Route 376, and he had pushed it 3 miles to the nearest building with a light on, and the light had been hers. She had been working late on a transmission job alone in the garage at 11 at night with music on the radio and oil on her hands and a focus that had not included room for the large young man who appeared in her doorway with a dead motorcycle and the look of someone who has accepted that things have gone wrong and is ready to begin solving the problem. She had fixed the bike. It had taken 3 days and 2 parts ordered from Reno. She had charged him for the parts and nothing for the labor, because as she had told him then, and as she now told Graves, the labor was the part she could choose to give. Graves said, "I tried to find that garage again. Twice." Marge said, "Why did you not call ahead?" He said, "I did not think ahead much in those years." She said, "No. Men rarely do." A silence passed between them. Not uncomfortable. The comfortable silence of two people who have said enough true things in the past 12 hours to feel the easy familiarity of shared weight. He said, "The Viper money. I need to tell you what Silas found." She said, "He already told me." He said, "I know. I am telling you anyway, because you deserve to hear it from me." She sat and she listened. He told her everything that Silas had known and what he had done with the money and what he had not known about the corridor and the van and Route 446. He told her in the flat, careful voice of a man who has decided to stop curating the truth and simply deliver it and let the recipient decide what to do with it. It was not comfortable, and he did not try to make it comfortable. That, too, she could respect. When he was finished, she said, "Silas told me there was something else, about the garage." Graves was quiet. He said he had done something with the land. He did not explain fully because he died before he could. Graves said, "I do not know what he meant." She believed him. The particular quality of his uncertainty had the texture of truth rather than concealment. There was more to learn here, but the night was not the time for it. She said, "Beck will be back." Graves said, "I know." She said, "He has connections. People he calls when a situation becomes inconvenient." Graves said, "So do I." She said, "And the caseworker, Reinhardt. She has been watching us since last spring. She is not malicious. She is simply a woman doing a job that puts her in the position of deciding what is stable and what is not." Graves said, "When is the next visit?" She told him. He said, "We have roughly 2 weeks." She said, "Perhaps less. She sometimes arrives without notice." Graves stood up from the cinder block step. He stood very still for a moment in the cold. He said, "We have 2 weeks to make this place look like what it already is." She said, "What is it?" He said, "A home where a child is loved and cared for by someone who would do anything before she let something happen to her." Marge looked at her hands on the kitchen table. She said, "Yes, that is exactly what it is." He said, "Then we make sure the paperwork says the same." Inside in the back room, Ivy was asleep. She had fallen asleep with one hand wrapped around a photograph of her father that Marge had found in the shoebox, a small hand holding on to the image of a man she was old enough to miss, but not old enough to fully understand. The oxygen concentrator hummed. The desert pressed against the walls. Somewhere on the highway north of Carson City, a truck passed in the dark. its lights sweeping briefly across the trailer park and then gone, and the night settled back into its particular Nevada silence. But the people inside it were still standing tonight. The conversation through the screen door lasted until past midnight, not because either of them was in the habit of talking that late, but because the things that needed to be said had weight to them, and weight slows everything down, the way it slows an engine under load, every rotation costing more than the one before, but the work still getting done. Graves told her about the vote, about the night he had walked into the Iron Revenant's clubhouse and confessed everything to the full table. The second ledger, the $20,000, the corridor Route 446. He told her about standing at the head of the table and setting the president's patch on the wood and stepping back and waiting. He said, "I thought they would vote me out." She said, "What happened?" He said, "They voted 5-2 to keep me in the chair. Not because what I did was forgivable." Boone said that clearly. It was not. It is not. But because the threat outside was bigger than the betrayal inside, and because the man who stands up and tells the truth about his own worst moment is not the same man who committed it. She said in Boone. He said Boone voted against me. He told me afterward that he believed me when I said I would burn everything to protect Ivy and Elena. He said that was what changed it for him. Not the confession. The fact that the confession meant I was willing to pay the full price. She said, "He sounds like someone who understands a particular kind of accounting." He said he spent 4 years in a state facility for defending someone who could not defend himself. He understands the difference between the cost of a thing and the value of it. He thinks about justice the way a mechanic thinks about load tolerance. You can exceed it, he said once, if you know what you are doing and you are prepared to replace the part. She said, "And were you prepared to replace the part?" He was quiet for a long time. The desert wind moved through the trailer park with its particular after-midnight quality cooler, more deliberate, like a different wind from the one that had been there all day. He said, "I do not know if the part can be replaced. The 2 people who died on Route 446 are not replaced by anything I do or do not do. That is the part of it I carry all the time. The rest of it, the club, the presidency, what the brothers think of me, whether Boone ever looks at me the same way again, that is all secondary. It is all noise compared to 2 names." She said Sarah White and Daniel White. He said yes. She said Silas carried them too. He kept a newspaper clipping about the accident in the same box as the ledger copy. He told me that was how he had decided to keep the ledger. Not as a weapon, as a memorial. He said if he ever used it, it would be in their name, not in his own interest. Graves said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had the quality of someone saying something for the first time that has been sitting in the throat for years. He said he was a better man than I was. She said he was trying to be. There is a difference. He was not born better. He was trying harder. You do not have to be born to something to earn it. He said, "Is that what you believe?" She said, "It is what I know. I watched him earn things his entire life. The garage, Elena's trust, his daughter. Every one of them earned, not given." He said, "He earned my respect a long time ago, before I knew what he knew about the ledger. When I found out he had known and chosen not to use it, that he had simply left and stayed silent, because he did not want to destroy what the brothers had built, I understood something about him I had not understood before." She said, "What was that?" He said that he loved the club more than he needed to be right. Most people cannot do that. Most people, when they know the truth, need the world to know they know it. Crow sat on the truth for years because he understood that being right would cost more than the truth was worth. It cost him anyway, just in a different currency. She said the currency of separation. Yes. He used to say that the hardest thing about leaving was not leaving the road. It was leaving the table. The specific table, the specific men. He said we should have known sooner. We should have found out he was gone before 3 years had passed. She said yes, you should have. But men do not always make the calls they should make, especially when making the call requires admitting that someone's absence has become a loss. He said that is true. She said Silas knew that too. He did not blame you for not calling. He told me that the years away from the table were years he had chosen, and that the choosing was his own. He said the only thing he regretted was that he had not had the chance to say that to Graves Mercer's face before one of them died. The night settled into something that was not silence exactly, but was the closest thing to it that a Nevada trailer park at 1 in the morning can produce. The oxygen concentrator hummed, A dog barked somewhere 3 units over and then stopped. The wind eased. She said, "I am going to bed." He said, "I will be here in the morning." She said, "I know. Good night, Graves." He said, "Good night." She went inside and turned off the kitchen light and stood for a moment in the dark. Through the back room door, she could hear Ivy's quiet breathing, slow and deep, the breathing of a child who has found for the first time in weeks a night that felt safe enough to sleep all the way through. She stood in the dark and listened to it for a long moment. Then she went to bed. Outside, Graves stayed on the cinder block step until 3 in the morning. He sat with his hands on his knees and his burned neck turned up toward the stars, and he said 2 names into the Nevada night, in the particular way of a man who has no prayer practice, but who has learned in the absence of ceremony to find his own version of it. Sarah White, Daniel White. The stars did not answer. They were not supposed to. But saying the names into the dark, into a specific dark rather than the general dark, he usually carried them in felt like the thing that needed doing. So he did it. Then he went to his bike and pulled his jacket close and waited for the morning. The first thing Vale did the following morning was drive to the pharmacy in Sparks. He did not ask Marge's permission. He told her he was going, and he told her what he intended to purchase, and he told her the price, which was not a small number, and he told her that the club would cover it. She began to object, and he looked at her with the calm, direct gaze of a man who has spent his professional life telling people things they do not want to hear, and has learned that the most efficient path through that conversation is brevity. He said, "You have been running on a substitute medication for 6 months. The substitute is managing the symptoms. It is not addressing the underlying condition. Every morning you do not have the correct medication is a morning your heart is working harder than it needs to. I would like to address that today." She said, "And if I say no," he said, "then I will spend today watching you very carefully and worrying which I am capable of doing indefinitely, but which I would prefer to redirect towards something more useful." She gave him the prescription information. He was back by 11 with the correct medication and 3 months' supply. The others worked. This is the part of the story that does not have dramatic music behind it, but that is in many respects the most important part. What the Iron Revenants did in the days after arriving at Desert Pines was not heroic in the cinematic sense. It was work. Saint, who had been a high school teacher before the bottle took his career, and whose hands had the particular versatility of someone who has rebuilt his life from a wreck and knows how to do things, replace the window glass in Unit 14 with materials from a hardware store in Reno. He did it in an afternoon cleanly without fuss, and when he was done, the window sat level in its frame for the first time in 2 years, and the cold that had been fingering through the gap in the plywood was shut out entirely. Deacon, who walked with a limp from a titanium rod in his left femur, fixed the heating unit. It was a repair that required knowing what you were doing and having the parts and being willing to lie on a cold trailer floor for 40 minutes with your hands inside a metal housing. He did all three without comment, and when he was finished, the heating unit ran as it had not run since Beck's maintenance man had last looked at it. Boone went to the grocery store. This was, of all the things the Iron Revenants did in those first days, the one that Ivy would remember most clearly decades later, when she was asked to describe what it had been like when they came. Not the motorcycles, not the confrontation with Beck, not the presence of large men in leather cuts, making her trailer park feel different. What she would remember was Boone's 6'4" and 260 pounds, standing in the kitchen of Unit 14, unpacking 4 bags of groceries onto the counter, with the focused attention of a man who had seen the inside of her refrigerator and had decided without drama or discussion to address what he had seen there. He did not ask her what she wanted for dinner. He made it. It was not fancy. It was the kind of food that men who have lived on the road learn to make well hearty, warm, the kind of meal that fills the particular hollow that is not just physical hunger, but the hunger that comes from a long period of not being sure the next meal was coming. Ivy sat at the kitchen table and watched him cook, with the alert cataloging attention she applied to everything new in her environment. And at some point during the preparation, she stopped watching with assessment and started watching with something else, with the slow, tentative unfurling of someone who has been cold for a long time and is not yet certain the warmth is real. She said, "You are really big." Boone said, "I have been told." She said, "Are you the strongest?" He said, "Graves is stronger than he looks, but do not tell him I said so." She said, "Why not?" He said, "Because I have been telling him the opposite for 12 years, and I would like to maintain my position. She thought about this. Then she said, "Can I stir that?" He handed her the wooden spoon. She stood on her toes and stirred the pot, and the kitchen smelled like something warm, and the heating unit ran in the corner. And outside the window, the desert evening was settling in its usual purple gradation, and Marge sat at the kitchen table and watched her granddaughter stir a pot of stew in a trailer that had a working window and a working heater and a refrigerator that was no longer empty. The thing she felt was not gratitude exactly, though gratitude was part of it. What she felt was the strange and specific relief of a long tension releasing. The relief of a woman who has been holding a wall up with her own body for years and has finally provisionally been permitted to rest her hands. She knew it was not permanent. She knew Beck had retreated, but not surrendered. She knew the caseworker would come. She knew her heart was not fixed by a new prescription, only better managed. She knew the ground beneath this moment was uneven. But tonight the heating unit ran, and the window sealed out the cold, and there was stew on the stove, and her granddaughter was standing on her toes stirring it. That was the first week. The days that followed developed their own rhythm, the particular rhythm of a household that has accepted help it did not expect and is learning to accommodate it without losing the shape of itself. Marge was careful about this. She had spent 50 years building and maintaining things on her own terms, and she understood the specific danger of gratitude, which is that it can erode the boundary between being helped and being absorbed, and she had no intention of being absorbed. She allowed the help where it was practical, and she maintained her authority over the daily decisions of Unit 14, and the men who were staying understood this without being told. Because men who have lived in collectives for decades develop a sensitivity to territory, and understanding that space belongs to whoever has established it, and that the respectful thing to do is to work within that understanding rather than rearrange it. Ivy adapted faster than Marge did. This was not surprising. Children are more plastic than adults in exactly the situations where adults most need plasticity, and Ivy was a child who had spent 2 years managing radical change and had developed in response a capacity for rapid recalibration that was impressive in a 9-year-old and would be formidable in an adult. She had assigned roles without announcing them. Graves was the one she went to when she had a question about the shovelhead that she could not find in the notebook pages she had memorized from her father's diagrams. Vale was the one she went to when she felt sick and did not want to worry Marge. Boone was the one she went to when she was hungry, at times that were not officially mealtimes because she had discovered on the second day that Boone's position on the ethics of between-meal food was significantly more permissive than Marge's. Deacon she was still working out. He was the quietest of them, and he spoke in a register that required more patience than the others. But she had observed that he watched things with an attention that meant he was paying close attention, even when he appeared not to be, and she respected attention. One afternoon, she sat beside him on the cinder block steps and said, "What happened to your leg?" He said, "Accident, on the road." She said, "Does it hurt?" He said, "Some days." She said, "My grandma's heart hurts some days. She thinks I do not know, but I can tell when it does because she holds her breath differently." He looked at her. He said, "You are very observant." She said, "My dad said that too." He said, "Engines will tell you everything that is wrong if you know how to listen." He said, "People are the same way." Deacon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He was right." She said he was right about most things. Another quiet moment. The desert afternoon was the color of old gold. Deacon said, "My riding partner died in the accident. That is why the leg does not bother me the way it should." Ivy looked at him. She said, "Because the other thing is worse." He said, "Yes." She said, "I know what that is. When something is so big that everything else feels small next to it." He said, "How old are you?" She said, 9. Almost 10. He said, "Nobody should know that at 9. She said, "I know. But knowing it is better than not knowing it, I think. Because when you know it, you can decide how to carry it." He looked at her for a long time with the focused attention she had noticed in him, the attention of someone who is seeing something clearly and accounting for it. Then he said, "You are going to be something." She said, "I already am something." He said, "You are right. I am sorry." She said, "It is okay." Most people mean it as a compliment, even when it comes out wrong. She went back inside. Deacon sat on the cinder block steps for a while after she was gone, in the same posture looking at the same stretch of trailer park, but the quality of the stillness had changed. Something had settled in it that had not been there before, the particular settling that sometimes happens when an old weight has been acknowledged by someone young enough to acknowledge it without the learned avoidance of adults. Vale and Marge developed their own working arrangement, which was the arrangement of two people who apply rigorous technical standards to their respective domains and who have recognized in each other the same baseline of methodological honesty. He did not tell her things were fine when they were not. She did not minimize information that was medically relevant. They conducted what amounted to daily informal assessments that were disguised as conversations about other things, and both of them understood what they were doing, and neither of them acknowledged it because acknowledging it would have made it formal, and formality would have made it threatening. He told her on the fifth day that the cardiologist appointment had opened a slot for the following week. She said that was fast. He said he may have communicated some urgency. She said how much urgency. He said the accurate amount. She said, what is the surgical option? He said a valve repair. The cardiologist will need to confirm, but based on the clinical picture, it is likely on the table. She said, who pays for it? He said, the club. She began to object, and he said, you are not going to argue with me about this. The funds exist for exactly this kind of situation. You can consider it a debt repayment from people who owe Silas Crow something that cannot be repaid directly. She said he would have been practical about it. He would have said the practical thing is to get the surgery and argue about the debt later. Vale said, he sounds like he was a smart man. She said he was. She paused. Make the appointment. He made the appointment. Ivy started coming to the motorcycle Graves had begun working on in the lot beside the trailer park, a 1978 shovelhead that Saint had pulled from the back of the clubhouse, where it had been sitting disassembled under a tarp for 3 years. On the second afternoon Graves set it up, Ivy appeared at the edge of the tarp and stood there with her hands in her pockets and watched him for approximately 4 minutes before she said anything. She said the pushrod tube seal is leaking. You can see the oil stain on the lower fin. Graves looked at the engine. He looked at the oil stain. He looked at her. He said, how do you know what a pushrod tube seal is? She said, my dad had notebooks, engine diagrams. He labeled everything. I have them memorized. Graves said, do you want to show me? She said, Grandma says I am not supposed to get dirty. He said, Grandma is inside and I have extra rags. She was in the engine within 3 minutes. She worked with the focused intensity of a child who has found the thing that makes the noise in her head stop. Marge watched from the trailer window. She watched her granddaughter lean into the engine compartment with grease on her hands and the particular expression of someone who is not performing competence, but simply has it. She recognized it in Ivy the way you recognize something you have been looking at your whole life without knowing you were looking for it. She went outside and stood at the edge of the tarp. She said, you have homework. Ivy said without looking up, I finished it at lunch. Marge said, show me. Ivy showed her. It was done correctly. Marge said 20 more minutes. Ivy said 40. Marge said 30. Ivy said, okay. When Marge turned and walked back toward the trailer, she heard a sound behind her that she had not heard in the 3 months since Ivy had come to live with her after Elena's funeral. The sound of her granddaughter laughing, small, brief, unguarded, the kind of laugh that escapes before the person decides whether to let it out. Marge stopped walking for a moment when she heard it and stood with her back to the two of them and let the sound settle into her the way heat settles into cold metal. Then she went inside and let them have the rest of the hour. The trouble came from the direction she had prepared for but had not fully mapped. Beck came back on a Saturday afternoon and he came with someone. Not Muscle. A man in a gray jacket who stood behind Beck with a yellow notepad and a pen and the air of someone who has institutional authority and knows how to use it. An inspector from the city's Housing Code Enforcement Office, which Beck had petitioned on the grounds of unauthorized modifications to a rental unit. The window. Saint had replaced the glass without a permit because permits cost money and time, and Beck had not fixed it for 8 months before they arrived. Marge opened the door and looked at the two men. Beck said city sent someone to look at the modifications to your unit. That is a lease violation and a code issue both, and I want it on record. The inspector said, ma'am, I just need to look at the window replacement. Marge said, come in. She let the inspector do his job. He examined the window installation with a flashlight and a level. Then he said, is it a good installation? He looked up. He said, yes, ma'am, it is. Better than what the original looked like from the deterioration pattern in the frame. He said, work done to a rental unit without a permit is technically a code violation, But the code also requires landlords to maintain habitable conditions. An unrepaired broken window in a unit with a minor resident is a habitability violation that predates the repair. In my professional assessment, if this goes to a hearing, the landlord has more to answer for than the tenant. Beck said, "That is not what I asked you to assess." The inspector said, "I assess what I find, sir." He closed his notepad. He said to Marge, "You may want to document the dates of the original damage and the repair if you have them." For the record. He left. Beck stood in the doorway. His face was the color of a man who has deployed what he believed to be his strongest piece and watched it not work. Marge said, "Is there something else?" Beck said, "You think these biker friends of yours are going to follow you around forever? They are going to go back to wherever they came from, and it is going to be me and you again, same as it has been." Marge looked at him. She said, "Harlan, I've fixed engines for 50 years. You know what I learned about machines that try to run past their design tolerance?" He said, "What?" She said, "They break, usually at the worst possible time, and usually in ways that cannot be repaired. You are past your tolerance. I suggest you think carefully about that." She closed the door. She went to the kitchen and sat down, and her hands were steady on the table, but her heart was doing the thing it did when the adrenaline moved through the damaged muscle. She breathed slowly, counted the rhythm, let it settle. She had managed Beck for today. She picked up the phone and called Graves. He answered on the second ring. She said, "I need to tell you something about the garage." She told him about Howren, the campaign of contract cancellations and false reports, the forced closure, the holding company that had bought her land within 6 months at a price that made no sense for a legitimate real estate investment. Graves said Silas might have proved the connection. She said, "That is what I think." He told her what he needed to tell her, the thing he had been carrying since Silas's letter arrived. About the second ledger, about the $20,000 and where it had gone, about the land. There was a long silence on the line. Marge said, "He bought the land back." Graves said, "I think so, or tried to." She said, "Where are the papers?" He said, "I do not know. If he filed anything, it would be with the county recorder in Nye County." She said his estate was a truck in a toolbox and a storage unit. "The storage unit is the shoebox on my table." He said, "Then the shoebox." She paused. She said, "I will look again." She looked again that night with the shoebox emptied completely onto the table and the overhead light on bright. She went through every piece of paper, every photograph, every receipt. At the very bottom of the box, stuck to the cardboard lining by a piece of tape that had dried and curled at the edges, was an envelope she had missed the first time because the tape had held it flat against the bottom, and it had looked like part of the box itself. The envelope contained a single document, a letter from a land title company in Tonopah, dated March 2018, 7 months before Silas died, confirming receipt of a title transfer application for a parcel of land on Route 376, Tonopah, Nevada. The parcel that had been Crow's Auto and Cycle Repair. The application was in the name of Marguerite Jean Crow. She sat for a long time with the document in her hands. The application had been submitted. Whether it had been completed, she did not know, but the application existed, signed by a notary, filed with the county in her name. Silas, who had planned things the way engines plan their fuel consumption, had been planning this. She called Graves again at 11 at night. She said, "I found something." She told him what she had found. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said in a voice that had the quality of a man hearing something that fits into the shape of a loss he had been carrying for years, "He was fixing it. The whole time." She said, "He was trying to." He said, "If the transfer went through, the land is yours." She said, "I do not know if it went through." He died in October 2018. The application was from March. He said, "I will have cross-check it tomorrow." She said, "Graves, whatever the title company says, it does not change anything about tonight or the hearing or the situation we are in right now." He said, "No." She said, "I tell you because you deserve to know. Silas was trying to do right by everyone he had wronged or failed or left behind. That is who he was. That is the quality he got from me, not the engines, the accounting, the need to square the books before you close them." Graves said, "He got that from you." She said he did. She put the document in her coat pocket close to her body and went to bed and lay in the dark and thought about her son, who had been 22 years old the last time she had been truly angry at him for something, and who was 62 years old in her heart when he died, and all the years between. In the morning, Graves called Marion Cross. She answered on the third ring, already at work, already in motion. She was 54 years old, precise, 30 years of representing clubs at the intersection of law and outlaw culture with the record to show for it. He explained the situation. She asked 3 questions and said she would check the Nye County Recorder's office by end of day. The trouble from the other direction arrived at 2 in the afternoon. Graves called. He said Dex Howard has people at the truck stop off I-80. 12 men. They are asking about the club. Marge said Howard. He said, you know that name? She said, he is the reason I have no garage. A silence. He said he knows about Ivy. He knows she is connected to us. He is afraid of what Silas left behind. She said he should be. He said Marge, the accident on Route 446. She said Sarah White and her son Daniel. I know their names. Silas told me their names. He could not say them without his voice changing. That is how I knew he had not made peace with any of it. He said, I have not either. She said, no, you should not have. But guilt without action is just self-indulgence. The question is what you do with what you know. He said, which is what Silas asked himself too. She said, and what he concluded was that the documents needed to be preserved and the people who carried them needed to be safe. He could not confront Howard, but he could make sure the information survived him. He said the information survived him, and now Howard knows it. She said, Graves. He said, yes. She said, I am coming with you when you meet him. The silence that followed lasted 4 full seconds. He said, Marge. She said, you are going to meet the man who destroyed my business and made it impossible to do what I had spent 23 years building, and who allowed a woman and a boy to date on a Nevada highway because it was more convenient than stopping his trucks. I have a right to be in that room. He said it will not be safe. She said I am 72 years old and I have been in rooms that were not safe my entire life. I know the difference between risk and foolishness, and this is risk. A very long pause. He said, you ride in the van. She said, I drive my own truck. He said, then I ride beside your truck. She said, that is acceptable. She made 2 more calls before the evening. One was to Saint, who was at the trailer, to ask him to stay with Ivy overnight. He said yes without asking why, which was the right answer. The other was to Marion Cross to ask her about the land title application. Cross said, I will check tonight. I have contacts there. At a guess based on what you have told me, a completed transfer that was mailed to an address you vacated since 2018, and that has been sitting in a forwarding limbo somewhere. It happens more often than you would think when people move during an estate settlement. Marge said, if it completed, the land is mine. Cross said, if it completed and you can locate the documentation, yes. Marge put on her coat. She checked her medication. She told Saint where the extra blanket was for Ivy and where the emergency numbers were taped inside the cabinet door. Then she drove north toward Reno and whatever was waiting in the dark. Graves and Boone had their argument in the scrubland at the edge of the property. It was not the first argument they had ever had. In 12 years as president and road captain, they had disagreed with regularity, the specific productive disagreement of 2 men who respect each other enough to say difficult things out loud instead of managing them around the edges. Their arguments tended to be short, direct, and to the point because both of them had grown up in environments where words were expensive and indirectness was a form of cowardice. This one was different. This one had history in it. Boone said, you brought her here without a vote. Graves said, there was not time for a vote. Boone said, there is always time for a vote. That is the charter. That is the one rule we do not skip. Graves said, the charter assumes a situation where deliberation is possible. A 72-year-old woman walked into the Silver Dust Diner with a dead man's letter and a granddaughter on a county watch list and a cardiac condition she had been managing on the wrong medication for 6 months. How long would you have me deliberate? Boone said, long enough for the table to weigh in. Long enough so that when the caseworker shows up in the Vipers Park at the truck stops and in the county hearing is in 9 days, the men who are standing here because they chose it. Not because you chose for them. Graves said, they are here. Boone said, because you called. Graves said, because I called and they came. That is the same as choosing. Boone said, it is not the same. When someone calls you come, that is what the brotherhood means. But the decision to commit the club's resources to a situation is a different thing from the decision to ride to a brother's side. This is not a brother. This is a woman none of us had met 24 hours ago. This is a dead man's family. This is the county and a caseworker and background checks and a landlord with connections and a Viper crew that is now asking about us. Graves said, none of that changes what needed to be done. Boone said, you are not hearing me. What needed to be done? That is your frame. That is your decision. Made alone. And that is the problem. Not what you decided, how you decided it. The wind off the desert was the kind of wind that does not give up. It found every gap in a jacket, every space between collar and skin, every moment of inattention. Graves turned his back to it and looked at the clubhouse lights dim in the windows, the shadows of brothers moving inside. He said I was wrong not to call a vote. Boone said yes. He said if I had called a vote, what would have happened? Boone was quiet for a moment. His shaved head caught the cold in the way of surfaces that have no insulation. He did not seem to mind. He said I would have voted against. Graves said, and the others. Boone said, hard to say. Vale would have been with you. Saint would have been with you. Deacon would have gone whichever way the room went. Riggs and Coyote are wild cards. Dutch follows you, but he does not lead. It would have been close. Graves said, and if the vote had gone against. Boone said, then we would have sent her back to Carson City with some money and a name and a phone number and told her to call if things got worse. Graves said, and the child would be on a watch list in a trailer with a broken window and an empty refrigerator and a grandmother managing a cardiac condition on the wrong medication. Boone said yes, that is what a no vote would have meant. Graves said, so I made the call. Boone said, so you made the call, and here we are. And I am not saying the outcome is wrong. I am saying the process was wrong, and the process matters. Not for its own sake, for what it protects. Because the process is how 12 men with 12 different histories and 12 different opinions end up able to share a table and a road and a name for years without killing each other. Graves said, I know that. Boone said, then act like you know it. Not in retrospect, in the moment. Even when the moment is the one where you are certain you are right, a long silence. The wind, the stars which were the kind of stars that only appear when there is nothing between you and them. Not cloud, not city light, not anything except the fact of the distance. Graves said, I owe the table an accounting. Boone said, yes. He said, when this is settled, I will give it. Boone said, see that you do. He turned and walked back toward the clubhouse. Then he stopped and turned back. He said, Graves, the woman. Graves said, what about her? Boone said, she is something. 72 years old with a bad heart and a 9-year-old and a dead son, and 20 years of being run over by a man who had more money and less conscience than she did. And she walked into the Silver Dust Diner and sat down across from you and put her dead son's letter on the table and told you exactly what she needed without a moment of theatrics or self-pity. He paused. Crow got that from somewhere. His ability to walk into a room full of strangers and make it clear without a word what he was made of. I always assumed it was something he had that we did not. Graves said, and now. Boone said, now I think it was something he learned from watching her. He went inside. Graves stood in the scrubland alone for a while, the way he stood when he was processing something that was too large to process in motion. The stars turned, the wind pushed, the clubhouse windows stayed lit. He thought about a woman who had kept a mold for a key for 19 years because putting it down felt like accepting that the thing it opened was gone forever. That was the thing Crow had learned from her. Not the stubbornness, everyone had that. Not the competence, though she had that in abundance. It was the specific refusal to finalize a loss before it had proved itself final. The mechanic's insistence on diagnosis before declaration. The understanding that something looks broken right up until the moment you find the fault. Because finding the fault means it can be fixed. He went back inside. He called a meeting for the following morning. The warehouse south of Sparks was the same building it had always been, which was a structure that had survived decades by being useful to men who needed a place that did not ask questions. Corrugated metal walls the color of dried blood. A loading dock that leaned at the angle of something settling toward earth. Inside the smell of industrial solvent and cold concrete and years of transactions that existed in the space between categories. Graves killed his engine in the gravel lot and looked at the 12 motorcycles already parked in a row. Then he looked at Marge's truck pulling in behind him, its headlights steady, its pace deliberate. She parked without hesitation and got out wearing her flannel coat and her mechanic's boots. And she stood in the gravel and looked at the building with the same expression she had worn looking at Beck's eviction notice. The expression of a woman reading the terms of a situation and deciding whether she would accept them. She would not be accepting them. Graves walked to where she stood. He said, "You stay near me." She said, "I will stay where the situation requires." She said, "You have been managing dangerous situations your entire adult life. So have I. They were different kinds of dangerous, but the management is the same. You read the room, you identify what the other person needs from the conversation, and you give them something that costs you less than what they are asking for." He said he may not be in a negotiating frame of mind. She said every man is in a negotiating frame of mind when the alternative is the kind of exposure that ends his operation. I have dealt with Dex Howard before, not in a warehouse, not with 12 motorcycles outside, but in a county permit office and in the parking lot of a diner in Tonopah when he told me he would make it very difficult for my business to continue if I did not sell. I told him no. He did what he said he would do, but I know the shape of him. Graves turned and walked toward the warehouse door. Dex Howard was thinner than the last time Graves had seen him. The kind of thin that money makes a man when he has been running a contained, calculating life for 17 years and has had no occasion for the physical expenditure of actual risk. He stood in the center of the work lamp circle with his hands in his jacket pockets and his pale green eyes moving between Graves and Boone and Vale, and then stopping when they reached Marge. He said, "Who is this?" Graves said Marguerite Crow, Silas's mother. Howard's expression did not change. His eyes did. Something moved behind them, a rapid recalibration, the specific internal adjustment of a man who has planned for several scenarios and is discovering that the scenario in front of him was not among them. He said, "I do not have business with her." Marge said, "You have had business with me for 20 years. You simply never bothered to do it in person." Howard looked at her. Whatever he had expected from a 72-year-old woman with mechanic's hands and a flannel coat, this was not it. She said, "You know my name. You have known my name since 2003 when you first tried to acquire my property on Route 376. You destroyed my business through a systematic campaign of contract cancellation and false reports to the licensing board. You bought the land through a holding company within 6 months of my forced closure. And then your trucks killed a woman and her son on a highway corridor I had nothing to do with." The warehouse was very quiet. She said, "I am not here because Graves brought me. I am here because the man you are afraid of was my son, and I knew everything he knew, and I have known it longer than his letters have existed." Howard said, "You are bluffing." She reached into her coat pocket and placed 2 items on the empty crate beside her: the envelope from the land title company and a photograph. The photograph was a copy of a ledger page that Silas had printed at the library in Fallon 3 days before the accident because he had not wanted the evidence to exist only on a device. She said, "My son was thorough. He spent his life working on things that could break and could kill people if they broke wrong. He was not careless about documentation." Howard stared at the photograph on the crate. He said, "That is not admissible." She said, "You are not a courtroom, and neither is the Pyramid Lake Tribal Police Department, which has jurisdiction over Route 446 as a federal connector through tribal land, and which does not operate on the same admissibility standards as a county court. My lawyer has been in contact with their office. Not filing, contacting. The distinction will become relevant to you depending on what happens next." Howard was looking at her with the expression of a man who has been playing chess and has just discovered that the piece he dismissed as a pawn has different movement rules than he assumed. He said, "What do you want?" She said 3 things. The first is that you leave Desert Pines and its residents alone permanently. Beck called you. Beck is your problem to manage. The second is that you leave the Iron Revenants alone. Whatever your history with this club, it is settled. The documents stay sealed as long as you stay clear. The third is the land on Route 376. He said that land was sold legitimately. She said, "My son believed otherwise and spent 4 years proving otherwise and filed a transfer application in my name 7 months before he died. Marion Cross is checking the county recorder's records as we speak. If the transfer completed, the land is already mine, and this point is moot. If it did not complete due to Silas's death, you will facilitate completion. You have connections to the holding company. Use them." Howard looked at her for a long time. He said, "You know what that land is worth now?" She said, "I know what it was worth when it was mine, and I know what it cost me when it was taken. I am not negotiating its market value. I am recovering what was mine." A long silence. The generator hummed, the work lamps buzzed, Boone stood behind Graves like a feature of the landscape unmoved. Howard said, "And if I agree to these terms," she said, "then the documents stay sealed, and you run your business without the weight of Route 446 in a federal jurisdiction." He said, "You realize this means you are protecting a man who let a deal happen that killed two people." She looked at him. She said, "I am not protecting anyone. I am managing a situation that cannot be unmade. Sarah White and Daniel White are dead. They were dead before I walked into this building, and they will remain dead regardless of what happens in it. My concern is with the living, my granddaughter, my heart which is not performing at full capacity and which cannot withstand the years it would take for any federal proceeding to reach a conclusion. You and Graves and the rest of this history are problems that the living have to manage because the dead have left it to us." She picked up the photograph in the envelope and put them back in her coat pocket. She said, "I will expect Cross to have an answer about the land title by morning. She will call your lawyer. You will tell your lawyer to cooperate." She turned and walked toward the door. Behind her, Howard said nothing. Graves fell in beside her in the gravel lot. He was quiet until they reached the vehicles. He said, "You were not supposed to be the one who closed that." She said, "Who was supposed to close it?" He said, "I had a plan." She said, "Your plan would have taken longer." She got into her truck. Her heart was doing the thing it did. She breathed through it, counted the rhythm, let it settle. Then she started the truck and drove home to her granddaughter. The days between the warehouse and the hearing had the particular quality of time passing under pressure. Not fast, not slow, dense. Every hour contained more than the usual number of things. Cross filed her brief with the county. It was 47 pages of legal documentation addressing every concern Reinhardt had raised, organized with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had spent 30 years learning that precision in paperwork is the difference between a case that gets dismissed and a case that gets decided correctly. Marge read it from beginning to end. She corrected 2 factual details. Cross thanked her, which was the response of someone who expected her clients to be capable of reading their own legal documents. Vale drove Marge to the cardiologist in Reno on a Wednesday. The cardiologist was a man named Feld, who had the particular directness of someone whose job involves telling people the truth about the organ that keeps them alive, which requires a bedside manner that is honest rather than warm. He reviewed the 6 months of substitute medication with the expression of a man doing mental arithmetic he has done before and does not like the results of. He said, "The valve situation has progressed. I want to schedule a surgical consult." Marge said, "How far has it progressed?" He said, "Far enough that the substitute medication gap is not the primary concern anymore. The valve is the primary concern." She said, "How soon?" He said, "The consult should happen within the next 4 to 6 weeks. The surgery depending on what the consult shows within 3 months." She said, "I cannot be incapacitated for 3 months." He said, "The recovery from a valve repair is typically 6 to 8 weeks for someone your age and general condition. If the surgery goes as planned and you follow the protocol, you will be functional and more functional than you are now before the spring." She said, "Define functional." He said, "Able to perform light physical work, able to drive, able to care for a child, unable to do sustained heavy labor for 12 weeks post-surgery." She said, "What is the risk if I postpone?" He said, "The risk increases with time. The valve is not going to improve without intervention. The current rate of progression, the surgery that is manageable, now becomes a surgery that is more complicated in 6 months and significantly more complicated in a year." She said, "Then we do not postpone." She said this the way she said things that were settled. Vale drove her back to Carson City without speaking much, which was his way of giving her space to process. When they arrived at the trailer, he said, "The club will handle everything. The scheduling, the cost, the logistics for Ivy while you are in Sacramento. You do not need to figure out any of that." She said, "I know." He said, "You are going to argue with me when I start making arrangements." She said, "I am going to tell you specifically what I need and what I do not need, and I expect you to listen." He said, "That is a form of arguing." She said, "It is a form of being precise. There is a difference." He said, "Noted." She said, "Vale." He said, "Yes." She said, "Thank you. Not for this specifically, for the way you do this. The way you pay attention to what is actually wrong rather than to what is easiest to address. It is a rare quality in a person." He said, "I had a good teacher." She said, "Who?" He said, "Tutors in a place where if you were not paying exact attention to exactly what was actually wrong, you and the person next to you would be dead." He paused. That is not a graceful way to say that you were kind to me in a diner in Carson City when you had every reason to be suspicious of me and no particular reason to trust me, but it is the true way. She said, you reminded me of a young man I hired once in 1994. Second week on the job, I found him under a differential case at 11 at night trying to figure out why a customer had been bringing the truck back repeatedly for the same problem that everyone else kept calling fixed. He found it, a stress fracture in the housing that only showed when the metal was cold. He was 23 years old and he did not stop until he found what was actually wrong. Vale said, what happened to him? She said, he married a woman from Lovelock and opened his own shop, and last I heard he was doing well. She paused. You have the same quality, the not stopping until you find what is actually wrong. Vale said in some people that quality is a compulsion rather than a virtue. She said in the best mechanics it is both. He almost smiled. It was a subtle thing, a slight shift at the corner of his mouth, the equivalent on his face of a full laugh on someone else's. But it was there. She got out of the truck and went inside, and Ivy was at the kitchen table doing homework with grease still on her left hand from the morning session with the shovel head, which she had apparently not scrubbed off with enough attention, and Marge said nothing about the grease, because some things are not worth correcting. Boone was in the kitchen making a second pot of coffee. He had made the first pot at 7 in the morning, and the second was required by 3 in the afternoon, because there had been a steady procession of brothers through the kitchen in the intervening hours, and coffee was what they ran on when they were not running on something else. He said, how did it go? She said, surgery, within 3 months. He said, okay. She said, I need someone to stay with Ivy while I am in Sacramento for the surgery and the first week of recovery. He said, I will stay. She looked at him. She said, it is not a simple job. She has school. She has a schedule. She needs to be fed at reasonable hours and driven places on time and helped with homework when the homework requires knowledge I do not entirely have, which at this point is mainly the mathematics, because I can handle everything else. He said, I got a GED in a state facility. I cannot promise much about the mathematics, but I can drive and cook and be present, which you have told me is the thing that matters most. She said, I said that to Graves. He said, yes, but I was listening. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, all right. She said it the way she said things that were settled. He poured her a cup of coffee. She sat at the table across from her granddaughter and watched Ivy work through an algebra problem with the same systematic focus she brought to engine diagnostics, moving from the known variables toward the unknown one with patient, methodical attention. She thought she is going to be fine, not because everything is going to be easy. Nothing was going to be easy. She had too many years and too much experience to believe in easy. But because the girl across the table had the quality that made fine possible, the quality of engaging with what was actually in front of her, rather than with what she was afraid of, the quality that the best mechanics had, and the best engineers and the best survivors, which was the ability to begin at the known and work toward the unknown without being paralyzed by the fact that the unknown was there. She was going to be fine. That was what mattered. That was the point. She drank her coffee, and outside the window the Nevada afternoon was going gold, and the motorcycles in the lot ticked in the cooling air, and somewhere in the distance on the highway that ran north toward Reno, the sound of another bike arriving, pulling in off the road, the engine note dropping as it slowed, the low, specific sound of someone coming home. The morning of the hearing, Marge woke at 5. She lay in the dark for a few minutes with the oxygen concentrator humming and the first faint gray of pre-dawn showing at the edge of the curtain. She had not slept poorly. She had slept the way she slept up most nights, which was adequately and without drama. The sleep of a woman who had long since made her peace with the fact that deep, untroubled rest was something that belonged to a different chapter of her life, and that the chapter she was in offered a reasonable facsimile of it. She got up. She made coffee. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at the trailer park in the pre-dawn gray, at the mud track, in the chain link, in the dumpsters, in the Unit 3 lot where Beck's truck sat dark. And for once, simply a truck and not a statement about anything. The Iron Revenant's motorcycles were in the lot. 5 of them had stayed the night. She thought about the hearing. She thought about it the way she thought about a complicated job that was coming in that morning, cataloging the known components. The documentation Cross had filed, the medical records, the school enrollment, the letter of intent, the cardiologist's written assessment. She ran through the potential questions and her answers to them. She thought about Ivy in the blue dress sitting in the hallway with her hands in her lap and her dark eyes measuring everything. She thought about the things she could not control, the background checks, the way the county representative would look at 9 motorcycles in a trailer park parking lot and make a determination about what kind of home produced a parking lot that looked like that. The way her own face looked when she was trying not to show concern, which she had been told once by a physician's assistant at the free clinic, who was 28 years old and did not yet know to keep that kind of observation to herself, that she looked like she was calculating load tolerances rather than having a human emotion. She drank her coffee and thought about all of this, and she was not afraid. She was as she had been for most of her adult life, simply present with what was coming and prepared to meet it. At 6:15, Ivy appeared in the kitchen doorway in pajamas with her hair sideways and her eyes not fully open. She looked at Marge. She said, "You are up already." Marge said, "I am always up already." Ivy said, "Before 5 is different." Marge said, "Sit down, I will make you eggs." She made eggs. Ivy sat at the table and watched her and did not speak, which was one of Ivy's specific intelligences, the understanding that some mornings were for being present rather than for conversation. She had developed this understanding young. It was a quality that usually took people decades to acquire. They ate together in the quiet kitchen, and the dawn came up outside the window. The way Nevada dawn comes up in November, slowly, reluctantly, the light seeping in from the east before the sun commits to the day. By the time they were done eating, the motorcycle lot was showing an early gray light, and there was movement in it, one of the brothers up and moving. She could not see who from the window. Just a figure in leather moving between the bikes with the particular purposefulness of someone who is awake because they chose to be, not because they had to be. Ivy said, "Grandma." Marge said, "Yes." She said, "What happens if it does not go the way we want?" Marge said, "Then we find out what the next step is and we take it." She said, "What is the next step if they say I have to go?" Marge said, "Cross files an appeal. An appeal takes time. Time is our ally because things can change during time." She said, "But you would fight it." Marge said, "Until there was nothing left to fight with." Ivy said, "You told me that before." Marge said, "It was true before. It is still true. Some things bear repeating." Ivy looked down at her empty plate. Then she said, "Deacon made me something." She reached into the pocket of her pajamas and produced a small wooden raven, carved from something pale juniper maybe, with careful detail in the wings, the feathers shaped individually, the eye a small precise dot. She turned it over in her fingers with the absorbed attention she brought to mechanical things. She said, "He left it on the workbench without a note." Marge said, "That is his way." She said, "How do you know his way? You have known him for 10 days. Marge said, "Some people's way is legible very quickly. Not their history, not their interior, but the shape of how they move through the world. I have been reading people my whole life. He is a man who expresses things through making them rather than saying them." The note was in the carving. Ivy turned the raven over again. She said, "What does it say?" Marge said, "What do you think it says?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at the small carved bird in her hand. Then she said, "I think it says he is paying attention, and that he will keep paying attention even when things are not easy." Marge said, "That sounds right to me." Ivy closed her hand around the raven. She said, "Okay, I am going to get ready." She went to the back room to dress. Marge sat at the kitchen table with her coffee mug and looked at the place where her granddaughter had been sitting and thought, not for the first time and not for the last, about the quality of 9-year-olds who have been tested by hard things. The way they come out of it, not harder, not softer, more themselves, more precisely, unambiguously themselves, as if the difficulty had burned away everything that was not essential and left only the essential things standing. Ivy was essential. She was the irreducible thing. Everything else, the trailer and the hearing and the caseworker and the cardiac condition and the landlord and the vipers and the years of loss and difficulty that had brought them here, all of it was context for the essential thing, and the essential thing was going to be fine. Marge finished her coffee. She stood. She went to get dressed for the hearing. Graves knocked on the door at 7:15 with a container of gas station coffee and a look on his face that said he had been awake since before the coffee. Marge opened the door and looked at the coffee and then at him and said, "Did you sleep?" He said, "I slept." She said, "How long?" He said, "Long enough." She said, "That is not an answer." He said, "It is the answer I have." She took the coffee container and poured it into a proper mug and handed the mug back to him and said, "Come in." He came in. He stood in the kitchen with the coffee and looked around the room with the assessing gaze she had begun to recognize as his default setting, the gaze of a man who has spent so many years in situations that could go wrong quickly that scanning for variables has become as involuntary as breathing. He said, "You look prepared." She said, "I am prepared." He said, "Cross called this morning." She said, "The brief is solid and the documentation package is clean." She has seen worse cases get better outcomes. She said she told me that on the phone the first night. He said she is consistent. She said it is her most reliable quality. She paused. "Graves, whatever happens today, I want you to know something." He said, "What?" She said, "Silas was right about you." He said, "He told you something specific." She said, "He told me you were a man who paid his debts." He said it was your most consistent quality. That once you understood what you owed, you paid it without complaint and without keeping a ledger of what you had paid so you could present it at a later date and call it sufficient. He said most people keep a ledger. He said you were one of the few he had known who did not. Graves held his coffee mug. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He gave me too much credit for that." She said, "He knew you. I will trust his assessment over your modesty." He said he left. She said he left, and he thought about you every day until he died. There is a difference between leaving someone and letting them go. He left. He did not let go. The letter in the shoebox is the evidence of that. He kept you with him by keeping his obligation to tell you the truth. He said, "I wish he had told me while he was alive." She said he was afraid of what telling you would cost. He was afraid it would destroy the club he still loved, even from a distance. He chose to wait until it was the only remaining option. That it was wrong. He knew it was wrong, but it was a human kind of wrong, the kind that comes from loving something more than you have the courage to tell the truth about. He said, "Yes." She said, "You would have done the same." He said, "I did do the same for 15 years. She said, "Then you understand him." He said, "Yes, I understand him." Ivy came out of the back room in the blue dress with her hair brushed and her hands clean, and the wooden raven in the pocket of the dress a small visible outline through the thin fabric. She looked at Graves and then at Marge, and she said, "Are we ready?" Marge said, "We are ready." They walked out into the November morning together. Three of them, and the motorcycles were waiting in the lot, and the brothers were awake and present, and Deacon leaning against his bike with the cane he had begun carrying, and the particular stillness of a man who has said everything he needs to say through a small, carved bird left on a workbench without a note, looked at Ivy when she came out, and she looked back at him and she put her hand briefly over the pocket where the raven was. That was all. It was enough. They drove to Reno. The road was clear, and the light was the cold, clear light of a November morning in the Nevada high desert. And Graves rode beside Marge's truck, the whole way steady, at the same speed, never falling behind, never pulling ahead. Beside her rather than in front of her, which was a different thing, the difference between leading and accompanying. And it was the right thing. It was the exactly correct thing for this specific morning, this specific drive, this specific woman who had spent her whole life knowing her own route and needing only occasionally someone to ride beside her while she drove it. The county hearing was on a Tuesday. Marion Cross was already in the waiting area when they arrived. She shook Marge's hand first. Then she shook Graves' hand and the hands of the three iron revenants who had come to the hearing. Three men in clean clothing, present but not performing. Ivy wore a dress. She had asked Saint to help her find something appropriate, and he had driven to a consignment store in Sparks and returned with a blue dress that fit well enough and that Ivy had approved with the brief practical assessment of someone who does not place high value on clothing, but understands that clothing communicates. She sat in the hallway with her hands in her lap and her dark eyes moving between the hearing room door and Marge's face. She had been told what the hearing was about. Marge had not soft-pedaled it. She was 9 years old and she had buried both her parents in 2 years, and she understood the shape of precarious better than most adults who had never experienced it. She deserved the truth about what was at stake. Ivy had listened. Then she had asked one question. She had said, "If they say I have to go somewhere else, will you fight it?" Marge had said, "I will fight it until there is nothing left to fight with." Ivy had nodded. Then she had gone to help Boone make dinner because that was how she processed things, by moving toward the engine and putting her hands on it. The hearing lasted 47 minutes. Reinhardt presented her report. It was honest. She presented the concerns from the September visit and the improvements observed on the November visits. She presented the documentation Cross had filed, the medical compliance records, the school enrollment, the cardiologist's written assessment, the housing condition report. She presented the background check results, which Cross had navigated with a particular legal precision that turns potential disqualifiers into non-issues through the alchemy of knowing which distinctions matter to which jurisdictions. She said, my professional assessment is that the current living environment, while unconventional, meets the stability criteria for the child's continued placement with her grandmother. I recommend a monitoring status rather than active intervention with quarterly check-ins for the next 12 months. The county representative asked 3 questions. Cross answered 2 of them. Marge answered 1. The representative said, Mrs. Crow, given your medical condition, do you have a plan for Ivy's care in the event that your health deteriorates to the point where you cannot provide primary care? Marge said, yes. My granddaughter has a family, not the family that was on the original forms, but a family that has demonstrated its commitment to her welfare over the past 11 days in concrete and documented ways, and that has the means and the intention to provide ongoing support regardless of my own condition. She named Graves, she named Vale, she named the notarized letter of intent establishing the Iron Revenant's collective commitment to Ivy's ongoing welfare. The hearing concluded with the recommendation Reinhardt had presented. Monitoring status, quarterly check-ins. Ivy Crow remained in the custody of Marguerite Crow. They went to a diner afterward. They filled 2 booths. Ivy sat between Marge and Graves, which she had arranged herself by simply sitting down in that configuration without discussion, in the way that children claim the geography they need without negotiating for it. She ordered pancakes. She ate them systematically from the outside edge inward with the methodical focus she applied to engines. Boone across the table watched her eat. He said, good work today. She said, I did not do anything. I just sat there. He said, sitting still when you are scared is work. Do not sell it short. She said, were you scared? He said, of a county representative with a clipboard. No. She said, of what then? He said, of the thing that happens when you want an outcome badly enough that losing it becomes a different kind of loss than the thing itself. That is what is scary, not the hearing, what the hearing meant. She looked at him for a moment, then she went back to her pancakes. Cross stopped by the table before she left. She said to Marge, I heard from the Nye County Recorder's office this morning. Marge looked at her. Cross said, the transfer completed. The processing was delayed by the estate settlement, but it went through in January 2019. The deed has been in the county's mail forwarding system since February 2019, flagged as undeliverable. They have it. I can arrange for you to receive the official documentation this week. Marge sat for a moment with this information. She said, the land is mine. Cross said, the land is yours. Cross left. Graves said Silas finished it. Marge said 3 months after he died. The wheels he set in motion kept turning. She thought about that, about the specific quality of Silas's thoroughness, the way he had planned the garage recovery, the way he had planned everything with the understanding that the effort required outlasting the planner. He had not known he would die in October, but he had arranged things so that his death would not stop what he had started. She said it will need work. The building has been empty since 2004. It will need everything. Graves said, we have a mechanic. She looked at Ivy, who had finished her pancakes and was now drawing something on a napkin. She looked more closely. It was an engine diagram. The push rod tube configuration from the shovel head labeled in small, precise letters. She said she is 9 years old. He said she has time. She looked at him. He was watching Ivy with the expression she had come to associate with him over the past 11 days. The expression of a man who has been carrying a specific name loss for a very long time and has found in the presence of this child something that does not replace it, but that occupies the shape it left. She said, Graves. He said, yes. She said, thank you. Not for the rent, and not for the hearing, and not for the warehouse. For coming when I asked you, not because you had to. He said, I had to. She said you had a debt. Debts can be discharged in many ways. You could have written a check. He said, Crow did not send you to me for a check. She said, no. He sent me to you for what you actually gave. He said, which was? She said, presence. Which is the thing that is hardest to give and hardest to receive, and that matters more than anything you can put a number on. The table was quiet. The diner noise moved around them, the ordinary hum of a Tuesday afternoon. Ivy looked up from her diagram. She said, "Can we go to the garage now?" Marge said, "There is no garage yet." Ivy said, "But there will be." Marge said, "Yes." Ivy said, "Then can we talk about what we will put in it on the way home?" Graves said, "I have some thoughts about the layout." Ivy said, "Me too." Boone said, "I have thoughts about the coffee machine because any workspace without a functioning coffee machine is a workspace I will not be returning to." The table broke into laughter, genuine and unguarded, the kind that happens when the sustained tension of a difficult period releases all at once into the relative safety of an ordinary afternoon. They drove back to Carson City in the late afternoon light, Graves on his Road King beside Marge's truck. The desert was doing what the Nevada desert does in November at 4 in the afternoon, turning from brown to gold in the long angled light, the mountains on the eastern horizon going blue and then purple as the sun dropped behind the western range. Ivy was in the passenger seat beside Marge. She had the engine diagram on her lap, still adding details. She said, "Grandma." Marge said yes. She said, "Are they going to stay?" The iron revenants. Marge looked at the motorcycle riding beside them at Graves's profile in the late afternoon light. She said, "Not all of them, all the time, but some of them, some of the time." "Yes, I think they are." Ivy said, "Because of Dad." Marge said, "Because of your father and because of what kind of men they are, and because some things that start as debts turn into something else when you get far enough into paying them." Ivy said, "What do they turn into?" Marge said, "Family. The kind you choose rather than the kind you are born with. The kind that shows up at 11 at night in a trailer park and fixes your window and fills your refrigerator because somebody asked them to, and they found when they got there that they wanted to be there anyway." Ivy was quiet for a moment. She said, "Dad was right." Marge said, "About what?" She said, "About them. He said they were good men in the complicated way." Marge said he was right. She said, "I think complicated is okay. I think complicated means real." Marge looked at her granddaughter. 9 years old, her father's jaw and her father's dark eyes and her father's precise, methodical intelligence. But something else too. Something that was her own and was still forming the quality of a person who has been tested by things no child should be tested by and has emerged not harder but clearer. She said, "Yes, complicated means real." They drove the rest of the way home in the comfortable silence of two people who have said the important things and do not need to fill the space with more words. The garage on Route 376 in Tonopah opened 3 years after the hearing on a Saturday in September, when the Nevada summer was finally releasing its grip on the high desert and the mornings had gone cool enough to work in before 10 without the heat becoming an argument. Marge had been at the building since 6. She had unlocked the front door with a key she had cut herself from the original mold she had kept in a coffee can in a kitchen drawer through every address change in every year since 2004. Some things you keep because putting them down feels like accepting a finality that you are not prepared to accept. The building smelled different than it had. The old smell, motor oil and dry Nevada air, had been replaced during the renovation by the smell of new wood and fresh paint and the chemical sharpness of sealant on concrete. But by the time she had the first engine on the lift and the first oil pan underneath it and the first pot of coffee running on the machine Boone had installed with the gravity of a man performing a sacred task, the new smell had begun to layer with the old one. And by the time the afternoon came and the sun through the west-facing windows turned everything gold, the building smelled like what it was going to become. Ivy was there. She was 12 now. Tall for her age, her dark hair pulled back, wearing coveralls that were too large because the adult small was the smallest available, and she had refused children's sizes with the quiet finality of someone who has moved past a category without making an announcement about it. She was working on the shovelhead, which had become over 3 years of weekend work, as much a teaching document as a motorcycle, every component having been disassembled and reassembled at least twice and annotated in a notebook that had grown from 1 volume to 3. She did not need Graves to supervise her on the shovelhead anymore. She asked questions still, but they were no longer questions about what to do. They were questions about why, the deeper questions of engineering principle and mechanical logic that require not just knowledge of what works, but understanding of why it works. Graves answered when he could and said so when he could not, and sent the questions he could not answer to contacts in Reno who worked in motorcycle engineering and who had begun to find the calls from a 12-year-old asking questions about cam timing with the precise vocabulary of a professional, both surprising and genuinely interesting. Saint drove down from Reno the Friday before the opening. He brought two things in the cab of his truck, a case of beer for the brothers and a hand-lettered sign he had made himself. The same lettering style as the originals that had been on the building for 23 years, which he had found in a photograph that Marge had in the shoebox, a photograph taken sometime in the mid-90s, when the building was new enough that the pride of it still showed in the way the person taking the picture had framed it. He had copied the lettering by hand onto a board and sealed it and brought it down without announcement, the way he did things, and when he hung it above the bay doors on Saturday morning and stepped back, Marge looked at it for a long time without speaking. She said, "Where did you find the photograph?" He said, "The shoebox. You left it on the counter, and I looked through it while you were at the school. I hope that was all right." She said, "It was all right." He said, "There were good pictures in there." She said, "Yes, there were." He said, "The one of Silas on the Harley, the one you have on the table." He looked happy in it. Not the kind of happy you perform for a photograph, the kind that is actually there. She said he was happy then. He had the road in the club, and he had not yet met Elena, and had not yet made the choices he made. He was 24 years old, and he had the whole complicated future in front of him, but he did not know it yet, and the not knowing it gave him something, a specific quality of present moment happiness that knowledge takes away. Saint said, "I know that quality. I lost it for a while. I am working on getting it back." She said, "The bottle." He said, 12 years now. But the quality I am talking about does not fully come back. It comes back around the edges, in specific moments, like this morning. She looked at the sign. She said he would have liked to see this. Saint said yes. He would have been standing right here with a cup of coffee telling you what you had done wrong in the renovation and what you should have done differently. She said he never told me what I had done wrong. He was too careful about that. Saint said, "He was careful about you. He told me once that his mother was the person he most wanted to impress and the person it was most impossible to impress because she had already done everything he was trying to do and had done it first and had done it without making it look like an achievement." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "He impressed me every day." She said it simply without decoration, in the flat declarative tone that meant something was true in the way that important things are true without needing to be argued for or proved. Then she picked up her coffee mug and went inside to open the garage. Riggs spent the morning mounting the new tool rack that Deacon had designed and built into sections over 3 weekends, a wall-mounted system that ran the full length of the South Bay and that accommodated not only the standard shop tools, but the specific tools that Marge had gathered over 50 years of work, the specialty tools and the custom-built tools, and the tools that existed because she had needed to do something that no existing tool was designed to do and had made the things she needed herself. These tools had their own section of the rack clearly designated with labels that Ivy had made in small, precise printing that matched the labels in the notebooks. Ivy had been organizing since 7 in the morning. She worked through the tool placement with the methodical focus she brought to everything that mattered, testing the arrangement against the workflow she had thought through during the week, adjusting, refining. She had opinions about where things should be derived from watching Marge work and from the notebooks and from the particular logic of how a job actually flows from diagnosis through disassembly, through repair, through reassembly, which is a specific logic that most tool storage systems ignore because most tool storage systems are designed by people who have organized tools but have not done the work. Coyote watched her work for a while and then said, "You have thought about this more than the rest of us have." She said, "I have been thinking about it for 3 years. He said, "Since the hearing." She said, "Since before the hearing, since the first Saturday, I came here with Grandma and stood in an empty building and understood that something that should still exist was going to exist again. That kind of understanding makes you start thinking about how it should be." He said, "Most people do not think that far ahead." She said, "My grandmother does. My father did. I come from people who think ahead. It is not a skill I developed. It is something I inherited and then practiced." He said, "Your grandmother says you are going to be better at this than she was." She looked up from the tool she was placing. She said, "She said that." He said, "Not to you. She said it to Graves." She thought about this for a moment. Then she went back to the tool placement and said, "She is usually right about mechanical assessments." He almost smiled. He went to help Riggs with the upper section of the rack. The first customer came in at 9:15. The first customer came in at 9:15. a man in his 60s with a pickup truck and an oil leak he had been managing for 2 months with additions rather than repairs. Marge diagnosed the leak in 4 minutes, gave him a timeline and a price, and took his keys with the brisk efficiency of someone who has been doing this for decades. He was surprised by the price. She told him what it covered and why. He left his keys. By noon, 3 more vehicles were in the lot, and the lift had run twice, and Ivy was explaining something to the second customer's teenage son about why you cannot diagnose an engine problem by the color of the exhaust alone. You have to listen to it, she said, because the sound tells you things the color does not. Graves sat in the small office with the window looking out at the work floor and drank coffee and watched Marge move through the garage with the particular efficiency of someone in their right place doing their right work. He was not good at emotions that did not have clear mechanical analogies. But this one had an analogy. It was like the feeling of an engine that has been running rough for years, finally achieving its correct tune. Not new, not repaired to the original. Running as it was meant to run at the tolerance it was designed for. Boone appeared in the office doorway at 12:30. He said the coffee machine has already earned its keep. Graves said, "You installed it." Boone said, "I installed it correctly." There is a difference between installing something and installing it correctly. He sat down in the other chair. He said, "She is good." The kid. Graves said, "I know." He said, "She is going to be better than good. She is going to be the kind of person who solves problems nobody else knows how to solve." Graves said her grandmother was that kind of person. Boone said, "Still is." They sat in the small office and watched Marge through the window under a pickup truck, with her feet visible from the underside, the same posture she had been in the night in 1989, when a large young man had appeared in her doorway with a dead motorcycle. The same competence, the same focus, the same refusal to let a mechanical problem be anything other than a problem with a solution. Graves said Crow was right about her. Boone said Crow was right about most things, just took longer to see it than it should have. Outside the office window, through the garage's open bay doors, the Nevada September was doing what September does in the high desert, burning off the last of the summer heat and letting the first of the fall light in the clean, flat light that comes when the sky has gone from summer's white haze to the deep, transparent blue that belongs to autumn. The sign on the front of the building was visible from the office window. Crow's Auto and Cycle Repair. The name that had been there before and had come back. A name that belonged to a woman whose hands had built it, and a man who had tried to recover it, and a girl who was going to carry it forward in ways none of them could yet predict. Marge's heart surgery happened the following spring. A planned procedure, the valve repair that Vale had been quietly preparing for since the first morning he held a pulse oximeter to her finger. It finally happened on a Tuesday in April in Sacramento, where a surgeon named Voss had a reputation for doing this particular repair on elderly patients with complicated histories and doing it well. The Iron Revenants drove to Sacramento, 7 of them. They arrived the night before, and they were in the waiting room when the orderly came to take Marge to prep, and they were in the waiting room 6 hours later when the surgeon came out and told Ivy, who had been sitting in a plastic chair for 6 hours with her hands in her lap, that her grandmother was going to be fine. They were there. That was what mattered, and the only way it mattered. The simple, irreducible fact of presence. Ivy sat in the chair and her shoulders dropped. She did not cry in the waiting room. She cried in the truck on the way to the motel, face against the window briefly, the way she cried, which was not often and was always over quickly. Then she was done. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She said to Boone, "Can we stop somewhere? I want pancakes." He said, "It is 11 at night." She said, "There is a 24-hour place 2 blocks over." He said, "Pancakes it is." The garage renovation took the better part of 18 months. It was not continuous work. The brothers came and went according to their lives and their obligations in the rhythm of the club, which continued to operate as clubs operate, with the internal drama in the brotherhood, in the road, in the table, and all the particular machinery of men who have organized their lives around something that is simultaneously a fraternity and a code, and a way of being in the world that does not translate well to anyone who has not lived it from the inside. But they came back, consistently, without being asked, without a vote or a discussion or a formal commitment. They came back the way you come back to a project that has become in some gradual and irreversible way your own. Riggs drove down from Reno one Saturday with the electrical conduit in the back of his truck and spent 3 days running it through the walls with Saint. Deacon came 2 weekends in a row to do the structural work in the East Bay, the work that required knowing how to compensate for the movement that decades of temperature change had made in the concrete floor. Dutch showed up one morning with a truck full of salvaged shop equipment from a place that had closed in Battle Mountain lights, and a compressor and an industrial parts washer that was 20 years old but had been maintained with obvious care by someone who had understood its value. Marge was there every weekend. She had recovered from the surgery with the focused efficiency of someone who had decided that recovery was a project with a timeline and a goal, and that the way to approach it was the same way she approached everything, by identifying what the work required and doing that work consistently and without drama until the work was done. She drove to Tonopah on Saturdays and she brought Ivy, and she stood in the building that was gradually becoming again what it had been, and she made decisions about what went where and what needed to come first and what could wait. Ivy did her homework in the building on Saturday afternoons, sitting at the workbench that Deacon had built into the east wall with the smell of new wood and the sound of the work happening round her, and the particular quality of concentration that she could achieve in spaces where people were making things. She had been doing her best thinking in workshops and garages since she was old enough to have thoughts worth thinking, which was younger than most people would have guessed if they had not known her. She was also learning. Every Saturday was a lesson, not formal, not structured, nothing that Marge called by the name of teaching, because Marge's approach to teaching was the same as her approach to diagnosis. You put the person near the thing, and you let them engage with it, and you answer the questions they ask, and you point them toward what they are not seeing, and you do not replace their judgment with your own, because their judgment is the part that has to develop. Ivy's judgment was developing at a rate that surprised even Marge, who had expected something good. She had the mechanical intuition that the best mechanics have the ability to hold a mental model of how a system works and to update that model in real time as new information arrives. She also had, which was rarer and more valuable, the patience to stay with a problem past the point where someone who lacked that patience would have declared it unsolvable. She had learned this from Silas's notebooks, which described the process of diagnosis in terms that a 9-year-old and a 12-year-old, and every age she had been since, could read and apply, which was what the best technical writing does. It meets you where you are and brings you forward from there. Graves came down less frequently than the others, but came without fail on the significant weekends. The first weekend the new lift was installed, the weekend the bay doors were rehung and opened and closed correctly for the first time since 2004. He brought the shovel head down one weekend in the second year in the back of Boone's truck, and they set it up in the first bay. And Ivy worked on it for 2 days and finished it, finally completely. Every system addressed every seal, replaced every component, either restored to specification or upgraded where the original specification had become obsolete. She started the engine for the first time on a Sunday afternoon in October, when the Nevada fall had turned the light gold and the mountains to the east were beginning to go bare. The sound filled the garage and filled the lot outside and carried in the particular way that motorcycle engines carry sound in open desert air for a distance that made the nearby mountains seem briefly closer. Marge was standing in the doorway of the garage. She heard the engine catch and settle into its idle, the lope of a big twin running right, and she felt something in her chest that was not the cardiac condition. It was the other thing, the thing the machinery had always given her, the specific satisfaction of a system doing exactly what it was built to do, functioning at its design tolerance, producing its designed output. The patient application of skill and attention to the process of making something run. Graves was standing beside her. He said nothing. He did not need to. Ivy sat on the shovel head with her hands on the handlebars and her eyes forward, and the expression of someone who has just arrived somewhere. She was always going to arrive. She had simply not known until this moment how far the road was. She was 15 years old. She would be 22 before she walked across the stage with a degree in her hand. There were 7 years of the road between that afternoon and that morning, 7 years of school in the garage, and the club coming and going, and the seasons turning over the Nevada desert, the way seasons turn in high desert country, with a brevity and a drama that makes each one feel like the last before you remember that there will be another. 7 years of Marge's heart holding on maintained and managed and monitored the valve that had been replaced in Sacramento, doing the work the original valve had failed to do. Not perfectly, nothing biological is ever perfectly mechanical, but adequately, which was the standard that mattered. 7 years of Ivy's judgment developing from something impressive in a 15-year-old into something formidable in a 22-year-old, which is the way talent works when it has the time and the support and the space to grow toward what it was always going to be. 7 years of the iron revenants coming and going present and absent the specific rhythm of men who have made an informal commitment that is not written anywhere but is understood by everyone as binding the way the best commitments always are. Ivy Crow graduated from the University of Nevada with a degree in mechanical engineering at the age of 22, specialization in powertrain design. Her thesis was on optimizing airflow in vintage V-twin engines, and the acknowledgments page listed 7 names that no academic review board would have recognized, but that anyone who had ever ridden Highway 93 at midnight would have understood. The graduation ceremony was held on a Saturday afternoon in May, and the Nevada sun was doing the thing it does in spring, hitting the desert at an angle that turns everything gold and makes the mountains look like they are lit from inside. Marge sat in the third row in a blue dress she had bought for the occasion. Her breathing was steady, her heart repaired and maintained, working at the best capacity it had left. Her eyes were clear and warm and fixed on the stage. In the front row, 7 men sat in a line. They were older. The silver in Graves's beard had gone fully white. Boone's shaved head was tracked with the faint lines of age. Vale carried the same book in the same inside pocket. Different book, same pocket. Deacon's leg had been giving him trouble for 2 years, and he had accepted a cane rather than acknowledge the pain, which was his particular form of stubbornness, and which everyone had agreed to respect. Reagson, Coyote, and Dutch occupied the end of the row with the patient presence of men who have been showing up for so long that the showing up is no longer a decision, but a reflex. Saint was not there. He had died the winter before a heart attack, quick the way he had always done things. They had buried him on a Tuesday in January, in a cemetery outside Reno, and Marge had stood at the grave in her good black coat and held Ivy's hand, and she had not cried until she was home alone in the kitchen, because grief like an engine runs better when you do not flood it. But he had taught Ivy how to do the electrical work on the garage, and the knowledge was in her hands and would stay there, which is the way the people who teach us survive us in the work our hands remember. Ivy walked across the stage. She shook the dean's hand. She turned toward the audience. She found them immediately. 7 faces in the front row, white beard and storm gray eyes, a drooping left eye, a medic's steady gaze. And in the third row, her grandmother's hands, large and scarred and unmistakable, pressed together in applause. She said into the microphone, "My father taught me that blood makes relatives, but loyalty makes family." The room stood. Marge was crying. She did not try to stop it. She was 82 years old and her son was dead, and her granddaughter had just walked across the stage with a degree in mechanical engineering. And she was going to cry about it because some things are large enough to earn it, and some things, if you do not let them move through, you will sit in your chest until they harden into something that is not grief anymore, but something worse. Graves did not cry. He was not capable of it in public, and possibly not in private, and this was a fact about him that everyone accepted as part of the architecture. But the way he watched Ivy cross that stage had the quality of the way a man looks at something he thought he would never see, a quality that has no single word, but that people recognize when they are in the presence of it. After the ceremony outside, the motorcycles were parked along the campus drive. 7 bikes, older now, maintained with the obsessive care of men who understand that things last longer when someone pays attention. Ivy came out in her cap and gown with her diploma, and she stopped at the bikes and she ran her hand along the tank of Graves's Road King. The same bike, maintained over 13 years with the same care it had always received. She said, "You kept your promise." He said, "Which one?" She said, "All of them." She reached into the pocket of her gown and took out something small and worn. A wooden raven carved from juniper, smoothed by years of being held. Deacon had made it for her the first winter at the trailer park and left it on the workbench without a note, and she had carried it in her pocket since the day she found it, through every school day and every engine teardown and every quiet night when things were difficult and she needed something solid to hold. She placed it in Graves's palm. He looked at Ed. His thumb moved over the carved wings. The grain of the wood was dark with the oils of being handled, the specific patina of something that has been carried by someone who needed it. She said, I do not need it anymore. He closed his hand around it. He put it in his cut against his chest, where the weight of a long and difficult history had pressed against his ribs for years, until the night in the warehouse when it finally became the weight of something else. Not lighter, not gone. Changed. The difference between a wound and a scar is not that the scar does not hurt. It is that the scar has sealed. The body has done what bodies do, built new tissue over the breach, slower and tougher, and imperfect in the way repaired things are always imperfect. Marge came out of the building and stood beside Ivy. Her granddaughter was tall, now taller than Marge, with her father's dark hair pulled back for the ceremony, and her grandmother's mechanic's hands scarred and capable. She said to Graveswell. He said, well, she said, the garage needs a new hydraulic lift. The one we have is original and it is getting unreliable. He said, I know. Riggs has been looking at options. She said, tell him I want to do the installation myself. He said he already assumed that. He said to tell you he will do the parts sourcing and stay out of the way. She said that is the correct answer. Ivy reached into her graduation gown and took out a small, spiral notebook, worn the cover soft with handling. She held it out to Marge. Marge said, what is this? Ivy said, I found it in the shoebox, at the very bottom. A spiral notebook in Dad's handwriting labeled engine diagrams. But it is not engine diagrams, it is notes. Things he wanted to say, things he thought you should know. I have been keeping it until today. Marge took it. Her hands were steady. She held the notebook the way she held things that mattered with both hands, the full attention of hands that knew the weight of things. She said, did you read it? Ivy said, some of it. She said, and, Ivy said, he said you were the first person who taught him that a thing you build with your own hands is a different kind of real than a thing you find already made. He said he spent his whole life trying to build things the way you did. He said he did not always succeed, but he was always trying. Marge held the notebook against her chest. The evening light was going fast now, the gold withdrawing from the mountains, the purple deepening toward the dark. She said he succeeded at the things that mattered. She put the notebook in her coat pocket, close to her body, against her heart, which was repaired and maintained and running at the best capacity it had left, pumping the blood of a woman who had worked and grieved and built and lost and built again, who had stood in the dark and not gone under, who had found at 72 what she could not have predicted at 52, that the world still had things to offer if you were willing to go looking for them in the places you had been too proud or too tired or too certain to look before. She said to her granddaughter, let us go home. They drove back to Tonopah in the dark. The garage on Route 376 was dark when they passed it, its sign lit by the one streetlight at the corner beach. The name on the front of the building, readable from the road, Crow's Auto and Cycle Repair. The name that had been there for 23 years and had been gone for 19, and was back now, the same letters on a cleaned and repainted sign, the same name belonging to a different generation's hands. Ivy looked at it as they passed. She said, tomorrow we will start on the lift. Marge said, tomorrow. They drove the rest of the way home in the dark through the high desert that went on for miles in every direction without apology for its scale. The road a thin line through the vast and indifferent and somehow perfectly appropriate landscape of the American West, where things are lost and found and lost again, where the sky is bigger than any problem a person carries under it, and where the wind, if you listen to it without expecting it to say something specific, will tell you in the way that only wind can tell things that you have come a long way, and there is still road ahead, and that is not a threat but a fact and a promise, both at once. Somewhere behind them on the highway north, 7 motorcycles rode in formation under the Nevada stars. And if anyone was watching from the edge of the road as they passed, they would have seen only what they always saw when men like these rode at night: the headlights, the sound, the brief interruption of the dark before the road went quiet again. But the interruption had happened. It had changed things. And the dark it returned to was not the same dark it had found.